So welcome back. So we're going to finish off chapter 10 with our evolution and its process. So in our final section of chapter 10, we're going to learn about speciation. So how do we end up forming these new species? So by the end of this section, you should be able to describe the definition of species and how species are identified as different from each other. You should also be able to explain allopatric and sympatric speciation, as well as describe adaptive radiation. And we already talked a little bit about adaptive radiation, but we'll go into more detail about what it is. Okay. So let's start out by defining what is a species. So we talked a little bit about what a species is already, but just here's the overall general definition. And this definition does have some issues with it. So it doesn't apply to all species, but it's what we're going to be working with. So species, specifically, again, we're going to be focusing on just sexually reproducing organisms. Species is a group of individuals that can potentially interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Okay, so basically, if we have two individuals from a population and they can potentially mate with each other and produce fertile offspring, then they belong to the same species. Okay, so that's how we're defining what a species is. But there are some exceptions to the rule. So we do know that there are what we call hybrids out there. So we do know that there are some individuals where we can take an individual from one species and mate it with an individual from another species and produce a hybrid. So that's not really that defies this definition, right? And sometimes those hybrids can even produce fertile offspring. So there are some exceptions for the rule. And then just for this definition, it excludes asexual organisms. So there's some holes in this definition here. So just realize that it's really, really hard to define what a species is. It's not very simple. But for the purposes of this class, we're just going to focus in on sexually reproducing organisms. And we're just going to kind of say that a species is a group of individuals that have the potential to interbreed and produce fertile offspring, and recognize that there are hybrids out there. Okay? So now that we have this definition down, we have to figure out, well, how do we end up with new species? So speciation is the formation of new species. And a lot of students think that the way we get new species is we take two species and we bring them together to form hybrids, and then that's how we get a new species. Well, that's the opposite, okay? So hybridization is not the way we get new species. Instead, it's where we have one species, and within that species, we have two separate populations of the same species. But over time, the two populations become so different from each other that they evolve different, functions, different forms, different genetics, to the point where if we brought them back together again, they can no longer interbreed. Okay, so that's where we get new species. So they diverge from each other. Okay, so that we're not talking about converging into a hybrid. We're talking about one species diverging into two species. Okay, so that's what we're thinking about with speciation. Okay, so they're diverging into different species. Kind of like here we see with the phylogeny of the elephants. Okay, so each one of these branches where they connect indicates like a common ancestor. And so we can see like the divergence of the different animal species. In the past, We had, different elephants that no longer exist, like the mammoth and the mastodon. And then today we just have two species of elephants, the African and the Asian elephant. And you can see that in our recent history, the mammoth elephant did roam around at the same time as the Asian and the African elephant. Okay, it was even around when humans were around. Okay, so our, it was here relatively recently. And so all three of them did exist within the recent past, and now only two of them exist. So this guy went extinct pretty recently. Okay, so let's talk about how we end up with new species. So there's two ways, through allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. So we're going to start out with an Amoeba Sisters video. So the Amoeba Sisters video will talk about, again, our definition of species, as well as the two ways that we can get new species through allopatric and sympatric speciation.
So if you've seen our videos before, you may know that one of us is a cat person. Well, the other one of us is a dog person. And when we were younger, we used to wonder, wouldn't it be cool to have one animal that is half dog and half cat, a dog cat? There was a cartoon we used to watch as a kid about that, although because of our TV reception issues, it never came in very clear. Hence our childhood of instead watching nature shows. As cool as a half cat, half dog animal would likely be, we need to understand that cats and dogs are different species. So what is a species? Well, organisms that are in the same species can interbreed, and their offspring can reproduce. That means the huge variety of domesticated dog breeds, they are all the same species, even though they can look very different. Same with domesticated cats. All the different cat breeds are still the same species. You can watch our classification video to learn about the hierarchy levels and taxonomy, but in this video, we're just going to focus on the level of species itself. Now, can two different species breed and have offspring? Yes. For example, let's consider the magnificent zonkey. Yes, it's a thing. It's a hybrid, actually, a cross between two different species, a donkey and a zebra. Pretty rare, but it can happen. They typically are going to be sterile, though. So even though the donkey and the zebra had the baby zonkey, that zonkey will not be fertile. Donkeys and zebras are different species, so this fits into that species rule. Speciation, which means the development of a new species, can occur when populations are reproductively isolated in some form. Why? Well, first, check out our natural selection video, which talks about natural selection as a mechanism of evolution and how change over time can lead to a new species. Our focus right now is to see how isolation can happen in the first place, which can give rise to speciation. If we're going to get a little more fancy, we could talk about two main types of speciation: allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. And here comes our disclaimer. In our short video clip, we are only giving some examples of isolation and how speciation can occur. In allopatric speciation, there's a geographic barrier that separates the populations. So while natural selection is acting on these populations, there is also some geographical barrier, like a river or a mountain, that keeps them from being able to interbreed and share the same gene pool. Eventually, over a period of time, there can be change over time in the separated populations, in their separated areas from mechanisms like natural selection or genetic drift. Over time, these populations can have significant genetic differences that may not allow them to interbreed, even if they were brought together. Populations separated geographically can form different species. You might think you would always need a geographic boundary to separate populations, but in sympatric speciation, the speciation happens in the same area, yet there's something else isolating them. So what is it? Well, it can be a lot of things. We'll talk about just a few of them now. Let's start with prezygotic barriers. That means barriers that occur before you can even make a zygote. A zygote is a fertilized egg, so a prezygotic barrier is not even allowing fertilization to happen. So of the prezygotic barriers, let's start with this first one, behavioral isolation. This is when species can have different behaviors, even very slight differences that can isolate them. For example, birds having different songs. Some only have a very slight difference, but this can prevent the males from attracting females of other populations. And these birds can look very similar. Appearances are deceiving. One of the common biology examples is the eastern and western meadowlark. Surprisingly, you can find them in the same area. They look so similar, but they are isolated by their behavior. Mates are attracted with a different song. Temporal isolation, species can breed at different seasons, years, even different times of the day. They may look very similar, but if they don't have the same breeding season, then you're going to have an isolation. Habitat isolation. See, even assuming that organisms live in the same area, that doesn't mean their habitats are exactly the same. You could have two species of amphibians living in the general same area, but if one prefers an aquatic environment and one prefers a terrestrial environment, that will be habitat isolation. Now, you can have post-zygotic barriers too. That means that mating and fertilization actually occurred because you have the zygote, a fertilized egg, but there is some barrier that separates the species even still. Remember our zonkey example? Well, that's a perfect example because the offspring is not able to reproduce. That's one barrier that separates donkeys and zebras. Sometimes offspring that are produced between two different species are very weak and they do not survive long. And sometimes, if species interbreed, the offspring is not able to develop, even in very early embryonic stages, because there is a genetic incompatibility. All of these are post-zygotic barriers that can happen in the same environment. Now, in our short video, we want to point out three things. First, this is just a very few set of examples of isolations that can lead to speciation. We encourage you to explore the huge list of other isolation types that can lead to speciation. Second, species can be impacted by more than one type of isolation. And third, please understand that isolation itself is not the mechanism for the actual change over time. Change over time, which can occur in gene pools of populations, can be due to mechanisms like genetic drift or natural selection. For example, let's take the case of natural selection. Remember that variety naturally exists in the populations. However, genes in a gene pool that results in high fitness, meaning more offspring, can increase in frequency of the population, which can cause the population to change over time. Isolation is what separates the gene pools of species, so the mechanism acting on the populations is acting on them separately. Well, that's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and we remind you to stay curious.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get into the details of the two types of speciation. So the first type of speciation is allopatric speciation. So this is speciation through graphic separation. Okay, so we have some sort of geographic separation take place. So in this case, we have an original population where somehow there's a division between that separates the population into two populations. Okay, so now we have two populations that are separated from each other. Now this population, these two populations are geographically separated. And if they're geographically separated, then we suddenly have the gene flow between the two populations becomes discontinuous, okay? It's cut off. And so they're no longer sharing, genetic information with each other. And so if they're no longer sharing genetic information from each other, they become reproductively isolated from one another. And if enough time goes by, generations and generations we're talking about, maybe several hundred generations, maybe several thousand generations, each of these populations will undergo natural selection within their own environments. Okay, natural selection will act on them independently from each other. Okay, And so during that period of time, the two populations will slowly become different from each other, okay? And they might become so different from each other that if those two populations suddenly were brought back together and mating does take place, they might not be able to, or they might not be able to mate, or they might not be able to produce fertile offspring. So in that case, they are now two distinct species. Okay, so speciation has taken place in that case. Okay, so if gene flow between the two populations is present, then speciation will not take place. If gene flow is not present, okay, they're geographically separated and enough time goes by, they might develop, they might evolve differences between each other to the point where they are reproductively isolated and become two different species. Okay? So, so when we're, like the video alluded to, when we have these, this reproductive isolation take place, during this time, you know, these changes that are occurring in the organisms have created what are called either pre-zygotic barriers or post-zygotic barriers. So pre-zygotic barriers are what prevents mating from taking place between the two, well now we're talking about two different species. Okay, so those could be, like the video talked about, they could be differences in like courtship displays if they're birds, so they don't really, you know, understand what they're talking about. You know, the birds calling each other, they don't know what they're saying to each other. The timing of seed dispersal for the plants, you know, things like that. So there's no way that they'll end up being able to reproduce because the timing's off, okay? Or there could be post-zygotic barriers. So if they do end up mating, that the zygote will not be viable, okay? So it might not end up surviving to birth, or it does survive, but then the offspring ends up being sterile, like the zonkey, okay? So those are post-zygotic barriers, all right? Now, when we're talking about allopatric speciation, you know, sometimes we have what is called like a founder effect, where we have a few members of a species moving to a new geographical area. So that's what we call dispersal, okay? So sometimes this happens like if we have a storm take place and like some birds are you know, caught up in the storm, and then they land like on an isolated island, like what happened with the Galapagos Island finches, okay? So they were probably blown off course and landed on the Galapagos Islands a long time ago from the mainland South America. And so they were able to, they were due to dispersal. So they, you know, arose into new species just because of, you know, they were there from a new, they formed from a new geographical area through dispersal. If a new natural situation arises that physically divides the organism, that's called vicariance. So vicariance would be like, for example, if we have like a lava flow. So let's imagine that we had a volcano erupt, okay, and the lava flow, you know, flows and separates two populations of ground squirrels, okay. So now, you know, there's one population on one side of the lava flow and the other population on the other side, and they can't cross the lava flow because they'll get eaten by the predators that are flying above, and they would get picked off. Okay, so now they're isolated from each other. So enough time goes by, they could be two different species at that point. Okay, so that's through vicariance. So something physically divides the organisms from each other. So dispersal, where we have a few species actually physically move to a new geographic area and, you know, settle themselves there, and then now enough time goes by that they are different from the original population. through allopatric speciation. And then vicariance is when we have something divides the population, physically divides them. Okay. So another example, we have like the northern spotted owl here in the Pacific Northwest, and the Mexican spotted owl down in the American Southwest. So these two inhabit, different areas of North America and Central America, and they both. So both of these owls, they look pretty similar to each other. They were actually the same species at one point in time, but now they inhabit two different locations. So you have two different climate zones. You have the American Southwest, that's a lot warmer and more deserty, and then the Pacific Northwest, more temperate environment, cooler climate, and so forth. And so their hunting habits are different, their prey choices are different, and so if they were brought together, if gene flow was restored, they would not be able to mate and produce viable offspring. So they are two different species now. Okay, so speciation took place over a long period of time. Okay. So this is an example of allopatric speciation. So here's an example of the dispersal example. So where we have a population of one species may disperse throughout an area. So we have in the Hawaiian Islands, for example, the honey creepers. So we have a founder species that again somehow got blown off course and established themselves on the Hawaiian Islands. And that founder species, the Hawaiian Islands is very isolated group of island chain, and there's a lot of different habitats there. And so once the founder species established itself and the population started to grow, it started to diversify. Okay, so because of all of the different habitats, the population started to diversify into many different species. And that's what we call adaptive radiation. So many adaptations evolving, causing the species to radiate into several new ones. So you can see all of the variety of species that evolved from the same species, okay, in a relatively short period of time. And that's just because of the abundance of resources. So all of these different different habitats or niches that these species could fill, they were able to fill those with the abundance of resources that were available. Okay, so that's through adaptive radiation. So being able to utilize the resources and establishing populations. Okay, so a lot of times this happens on island communities, so we end up with endemic species that you see nowhere else in the world. So all of these species are endemic to Hawaii, and it just came from, again, evolving from one single species that landed there a long time ago through dispersal. So that's one type of speciation. And again, allopatric speciation is a type of speciation that takes a long time to occur. So it doesn't happen overnight. The other type, speciation, occurs without geographic separation, and it's called sympatric speciation. Now this one occurs in the same geographic space, so it can actually occur really, really quickly. So this occurs when there's an error during meiosis, and it results in polyploidy. Okay, so an example of this would be something called autopolyploid. So we can end up where we have a diploid parent who ends up undergoing meiosis, but for whatever reason, the meiosis doesn't quite work out the way it's supposed to. and it doesn't divide. And so the gametes end up being diploid instead of haploid. So you end up with, gametes that are diploid instead of haploid. So you end up with 2 or more complete sets of chromosomes. And then because we're talking about plants, most likely, plants, they can self-fertilize. So if you have a diploid parent that can self-fertilize, then you end up with a tetraploid offspring, okay? So you have diploid parent that self-fertilizes, you get a tetraploid offspring that is a new species because it's different from the parent, okay? The parent is 2N, the offspring is 4N. It's a tetraploid. It has twice as much genetic material as the parent. So it is a new species, okay? So this is what we consider an autoploid. It's a completely new species. It occurred overnight. It occurred randomly overnight. This didn't occur over thousands of years. We have one new species occurring from one individual plant, okay? So sympatric speciation can occur in the same spot by the same individual plant, okay? So now we have a new species of plant. So plants, they can do this. And so this is how we end up with a lot of, I think there's 5,000 species of rice out there because they keep doing this, and 5,000 species of corn because they end up doing these polyploid things. There's some of them that have 5,000 chromosomes inside of them, okay, because they keep doing these polyploids. Another way is through alloploid. So alloploid occurs when individuals of 2 different species reproduce to form a viable offspring. Okay, so we have, basically it's like hybridizing, but they can do that with plants. Okay, so, it's harder to do that with animals, but plants, they can do that. So we have species 1 and then species 2, and then they can mate and produce viable offspring. And then the offspring is different from both the parents. Okay. And so we end up with offspring that are, new species that are neither don't look anything like the parents. Okay. And so again, this occurs a lot with plants, not with animals. Okay. You don't see this happening with animals. All right, so this is sympatric speciation, where we have speciation occurring in the middle of a regular population, and speciation occurring right smack in the middle of the same population. Okay, so a new species is forming right there. Now we can have sympatric speciation occurring with animals. An example of that could occur in highly competitive environments. We can see some reproductive isolation taking place. For an example would be with cichlids in Lake Victoria. There's over 400 species of cichlids in just this one lake in Africa. And we think it's due to the fact that they're highly competitive, and so when you put, you have this one species of fish in this lake, they have to come up with new resources to feed on. Otherwise, they're all gonna outcompete each other and all die off. And so what ends up happening is there's that selective pressure in order for them to find a new resource to eat or to feed off of. And so the cichlids, they tend to adapt to new food sources that are unused by other fish. So we have the thin-lipped cichlid versus the thick-lipped cichlid. And so the thick-lipped cichlid can go after a new food source that the thin-lipped cichlid cannot. And so now it has a distinct advantage. And so it soon can utilize a resource that the others cannot. And suddenly it is reproductively isolated. And so it forms a new species. Okay, so sometimes we do see this occurring with animals where they can become reproductively isolated and form new species in a highly competitive environment. And it's just through what we call resource partitioning. Okay. We've also seen this just randomly. We see reproductive isolation occur due to a host species. So we have this apple maggot fly where it's became its own new species due to its preference of laying eggs on an apple. Okay, so this, the original population just laid its eggs on other types of fruit, but then this particular fly suddenly only preferred laying its eggs on apples, and so it became the apple maggot fly, and it would only lay its eggs on apples. And so suddenly it became its own species because it became reproductively isolated. It would not lay its eggs on any other fruit. And so because of that reproductive isolation, it became its own species. And so that wasn't due to geographic isolation, it was just due to its preference for the host species, the apple. Okay. So sympatric speciation, where we have a new species forming right in the middle of the old population. Pretty interesting. All right, so we're going to do some review questions. So the first question, which situation would most likely lead to allopatric speciation? Would it be A, a flood causes the formation of a new lake, B, a storm causes several large trees to fall down, C, a mutation causes a new trait to develop, or D, an injury causes an organism to seek out a new food source? So which of these is an example of allopatric speciation? If you said A, I would agree with you. So a flood causes the formation of a new lake. So now we have this geographic barrier. And so it might be harder for species to make its way around the lake. And so now they're kind of isolated from each other. And the two populations have reduced gene flow. So A is the correct answer. Here's another question. What is the main difference between dispersal and vicariance? Is it A, one leads to allopatric speciation, whereas the other leads to sympatric speciation? B, one involves the movement of the organism, whereas the other involves a change in the environment? Or is it C, one depends on a genetic mutation occurring, whereas the other does not? Or is it D, one involves closely related organisms, whereas the other involves only individuals of the same species? So what's the main difference between dispersal and vicariance? If you said B, I would agree with you. One involves the movement of the organism, dispersal, whereas the other involves a change in the environment, vicariance. Okay, so remember dispersal, we have a new population geographically moving to another area, and then vicariance is some sort of separation occurs within the environment, separating the populations from each other. Okay, through some natural cause. So B is the correct answer. And then finally we have, which variable increases the likelihood of allopatric speciation taking place more quickly? Would it be A, lower rate of mutation, B, longer distance between divided groups, C, increased instances of hybrid formation, or D, equivalent numbers of individuals in each population? So which one increases the likelihood of allopatric speciation? If you said B, I would agree with you. Longer distances between divided groups. The further away you are from each other, the more reproductively isolated you are from each other, the less likely gene flow takes place. So if you have no gene flow, that means that the populations are going to be isolated from each other. natural selection will act on each population independently. And so that means that they will evolve independently from each other. And so allopatric speciation is more likely to take place quickly, okay, or quicker than the others. All right, so B is the correct answer. All right, so we are done with chapter 10. So by now you should be able to describe the definition of species and how species are identified as different. You should also be able to explain allopatric and sympatric speciation and describe adaptive radiation. So the next video, we're going to get into our lab topic 9, which is on evolution. So we're going to take a look at mutations and antibiotic sensitivity and natural selection.